The COVID-19 pandemic pushed innovators around the world to develop solutions or digital public goods on top of digital public infrastructure to slow disease spread or extend financial help to build an equitable society. To discuss this, please welcome on stage Liv Mart Nordhaug, co-lead Digital Public Goods Alliance, Kathleen McGovern, Senior Director, Policy and Advocacy, Digital Impact Alliance United Nations Foundation, Chetan Krishnaswamy, Vice President, Public Policy, Amazon India. This discussion will be moderated by Obra Anthony, Senior Fellow, Technology and International Affairs Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Please.
Welcome. I think Amandeep just set this panel up very well with his video remarks. And I think we've seen through the discussion today, I think it bears repeating, but it's almost trite at this point, just how critical digital public infrastructure is and how valuable it is when governments invest in digital public infrastructure. After having lived through the COVID pandemic and seeing the way that digital technology can literally be life-saving when used by governments, we clearly see that there's vast potential here. Digital public infrastructure can help countries in their ambitions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And digital public goods can be a key enabler for this infrastructure. But we've also seen that as DPIs and DPGs can be such transformative things and offer such transformational potential for society, they can also pose risks and they can also introduce harm. They can offer risks around privacy. They can offer risks around cybersecurity vulnerabilities, just like any digital technology. They can be misused or abused. ID systems, digital health infrastructure, digital payment systems, all of these can offer a lifeline to those in need, and they can also be problematic if they're not appropriately implemented or governed. One of the biggest benefits of digital public goods as well may also be one of the biggest challenges. They require a great deal of collaborative effort in order to reach the economies of scale that make them so worthwhile. And also, as we heard earlier on the digital payments panel, a key feature of digital public goods and digital public infrastructure, interoperability, it's a technical term, but it has so many layers beyond just technical protocols. The value that comes from interoperability at the human level cannot be overstated. And so I hope that our discussion today on that human element of interoperability, right, the collaborations, the partnerships, the alliances that are so needed to ensure that digital public infrastructure actually serves the people. I think we have a wonderful panel to talk through that with us today. We want to focus not just on how we can push the international community toward more digital public infrastructure, but also how we can partner to arrive at digital public infrastructure and digital public goods that, as Amandeep was saying, are safe and are resilient against misuse and abuse. So I want to dive in and hear from the three of you. So Liv, let's start with you. In your role as co-lead for the Digital Public Goods Alliance, I'm sure you have many insights to offer across everything I just mentioned, but let's start narrow, because I think it's helpful for this conversation to distinguish between the two terms that we're going to be throwing around, digital public infrastructure on the one hand, and then digital public goods on the other. They're interrelated, they're very interdependent sometimes, but they are distinct. So if you can help us first kind of narrow in on a definition for each of those, And then more broadly, if you could also share your role with the DPGA, how you approach partnership, and what you've seen the value of different stakeholders can be to this space.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I think it's been around 11 hours of panels now, so I'm actually quite happy to see that there's still quite an audience here. There has been so many very interesting discussions today that I would really like to try to pull together. And I do think it's great to start with definitions and to also help frame the rest of the discussion. So if we start with digital public infrastructure, which we've heard a lot about today, it is typically referring to these horizontal cross-sectoral enablers, the foundations that other things build on top of. The public in digital public infrastructure has a dual meaning. It's typically enabled, defined, sometimes governed by the government, the public. And it's also typically operating at national scale. So it covers everyone within that particular geography. And then if we contrast that with digital public goods, there is indeed a lot of alignment there, but digital public goods are more referring to the economics definition of public goods as non-rivalrous and non-excluding, meaning that anyone can adopt and adapt them. So the definition of digital public goods is open source, and this is a definition that is defined by the UN Secretary General in the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation as open source software, open data, open AI, open content, open standards that adhere to certain best practices and laws, for instance, related to privacy, that are relevant for attaining the Sustainable Development Goals and that do no harm. So that's a broad agenda. But I think the important part here is that when we talk about digital public infrastructure, they are not automatically globally adoptable and adaptable, because digital public infrastructure is not necessarily open source. So to take an example, Aadhaar, the digital identity system that is such a foundational part of the India stack, is indeed a digital public infrastructure. And it's indeed also operating at national scale in India. But another country cannot freely adopt and adapt Aadhaar. However, there exists a more generic, and I would say open source version that has very much been inspired by Aadhaar, which is MOSIP, the Modular Open Source Identity Platform, which is a digital public good. And I think that distinction is very critical when we talk about how we can potentially help accelerate and support other countries, particularly resource-constrained settings, to build out inclusive digital public infrastructure, indeed inspired by the India stack. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think it's worth highlighting that, as you just mentioned, so digital public infrastructure, often there are reasons not to have it be built on digital public goods or reliant on digital public goods, but increasingly that seems to be a key thread for the attainment of the SDGs and for encouraging a more level playing field, right, as multiple countries are looking to establish digital public infrastructure. Chitan, I'd like to move next to you. We heard earlier from India's G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, that India's successful model of developing digital public infrastructure was foundationally dependent on partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. And he spelled out, the role for government on the one hand is to establish regulatory guardrails and the kinds of strong policy frameworks that are needed for digital public infrastructure. And then it's the role for the private sector to come in and innovate and bring that to realization. And so I want to hear from you, from your vantage point in helping to partner to invest in the digital infrastructure here in India in particular, but also any other context you'd like to bring in. Can you speak a little bit to your engagement and your partnership around digital public infrastructure here in India?
No, thanks a lot for that. But before I recount or narrate the India story, which has been, told and recounted on multiple occasions, it's important to, recognize the actual value that the organizations of both my two co-panelists bring to, DPI and DPGs, right? End of the day, between the United Nations and the DPGA, there has been tremendous amount of work, catalytic work, that has resulted in deployments of the DPI across the globe, and in an extremely effective, efficient manner. And coming to the India story, if you, want me to relate to it as an Indian citizen, I would say it's easily one of our historic, most, proudest milestone in terms of what we've been able to achieve in an extremely short span. Moreover, very clearly there is an understanding that deploying the DPIs at scale would be extremely critical for us to, I just heard the United Nations person there mention that, we're way past in our SDG sort of goals, right? And one big way to go about attaining those milestones would be to deploy the infrastructure that we want. And essentially, a digital public infrastructure constitutes of three elements, right? Number one, the ID, which is most important, and we have it in Aadhaar. And then you have a payments layer, which again, we have created with UPI. And of course, data exchanges. And there are multiple exchanges currently in India which are functioning. So these three elements clearly constitute a DPI, right? And end of the day, there is a government which very strongly believes in the power of technology, which believes that it's important to harness the value of this infrastructure to really bring in more people into the, into a more fruitful and a society that is far more enriching, right? So there is that recognition. And Aadhaar, of course, as multiple individuals have spoken about since morning, has been a fundamental building block on top of which most of these digital services have been sort of crafted or created, right? It could be the UPI, which today results in about $300 billion worth of transactions, to the digital payments scene overall. And by financial year 27, this would go up to $1 trillion, right? The overall digital payments, quantum in this country. And of course, you also have CoWIN, which was again built entirely, on top of this layer, on top of the Aadhaar layer. And all of us saw the tremendous work that happened during the COVID, right? We saw how funds were dispersed. We saw how vaccinations were sort of affected. And today, by virtue of CoWIN, you have 2.19 billion vaccinations that have been, sort of rolled out with about 110 million registrations. So, end of the day, the India's belief and ability to create the infrastructure required to really scale our resources and reach people in the hinterlands is pretty convincing. And as an Indian citizen, there is a degree of comfort level and trust that has come with it, right? So there is a natural and a very obvious, mode of engagement that occurs with the infrastructure, with the digital infrastructure that exists today. And we're also seeing India now slowly and surely sort of proliferating the solid infrastructure that we've built into other countries. It could be the UPI, COBIN, and this is just the beginning. So as we go into other questions, I'll probably delve into various other facets of the experience that we've had.
Yeah, thank you, Chetan. Maybe we can move next to UK. So I know your experiences both at the UN Foundation with DIAL, but also during our shared time at USAID, have given you some firsthand experience with the life-changing potential that digital technologies and digital infrastructure can offer. Digital IDs, digital payments, the way that these things can affect the lives of those living at the margins. But I think you also have some great insights on the risks that can be present when these systems are rolled out in the absence of trust, or in a way that exacerbates a lack of trust or power imbalances. And so I'd love to hear from you if you can share both what DIAL does in this domain, what you have done to learn more about the two sides of that coin, right? The benefits as well as the risks and the safeguards that might be needed. Your thoughts on that?
Great, thanks. And I just want to thank the Ministry of External Affairs and Carnegie India for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. It's been a fascinating first day. I personally love the title of this conference, The Geopolitics of Technology. And it's really an apt reminder, because when we talk about digital public infrastructure, we're usually talking about it within the realm of development outcomes, right? Which really assumes good intent and assumes good outcomes. And I think that by framing it just around social safety nets and the ability to reach more people, which is incredibly, incredibly important and an unparalleled opportunity through these digital platforms. It also, downplays the real risk of unintended consequences. There's this famous speech that President Clinton gave, or maybe infamous at this point. Some of you may remember this, in 2000, where he was hailing the internet as the demonstration of the triumph of liberty, right? And this was in the very early days of the Chinese government's attempt to censor content and expression on the internet. And he laughed that off in this speech, and he said, "Good luck, that's like nailing Jell-O to the wall," right? And of course, you fast forward a couple of decades, and we have major countries around the world today where the most effective form of political dissent is holding up a blank sheet of paper, right? So I think this unintended consequences we need to really keep in mind. And I loved the fact that Minister Jaishankar, the very first words out of his mouth at the beginning of the conference today was that technology is not neutral. And I've been gratified to hear that echoed many, many times, especially if you think about the fact that today, Freedom House, I was reading something the other day that over 60% of the global population live under governments that are considered more autocratic than they are free, right? And so when we're talking about building these very powerful systems, especially if the impetus is coming from the state, we need to be very, very thoughtful about the safeguards that are required to make sure we're not falling into those unintended consequences. I had the chance in 2018 to spend quite a bit of time here in India, really researching and looking and trying to understand how the India stack, the DPI, was impacting people in practice. And you could see even then the difference. I remember making a field trip to Uttar Pradesh, where it was just amazing how they were integrating the authentication function of Aadhaar, the new payments interoperability capabilities of the UPI. And you could talk to villagers, and they would extol the new digitized system and say, for the first time, I understand what my benefits are supposed to be, and I get them in full. And then we made other trips, right? I went to Jharkhand, And I remember being in the outskirts of Ranchi and seeing how the digital tools, the way they were being implemented within the subsidized food program there, were being used exactly the opposite, right? People were talking about being more excluded than before, and that middlemen in the village that were running these systems were given yet one more tool to hold over people. So I think it's a great reminder that we need these constant adjustments, and we need the checks and balances that come from researchers and academics, that come from a really concerned and lively media, the way you have here in India, and an active civil society, again, which you have here in India. But in a lot of the countries that we're all talking about exporting DPI to, or the India Stack model, those same checks and balances aren't necessarily as strong. And so I think we have to do some real thinking, and this is what a big part of the Digital Impacts Alliance research agenda is actually on. What are the safeguards that really do then deliver trust? And not just public trust, but trust in a more meta sense, right? Because there are things that you have to think about in design, but also in implementation, and then all of this infrastructure of trust that that's required to make these things work.
Those are really helpful examples to ground this discussion in, just in terms of how this can be a conversation about promise and potential, and it can also be a conversation around the opposite of that, right? How these tools can also be used to exclude or exploit. And I think it also, the very last thing that you just said also points to some optimism if we can get the collaborative side right, the partnership side right, and ensure that members of civil society are part of the feedback loop in setting the rules of the road and informing how regulations get constructed, and ensuring that academics are able to participate and help shape the thinking around what's needed and how to establish trust. So all of those are really great points. I'm going to rush us because we have a very limited time, and I want to get to a very important question, which is, we all know that India is assuming the G20 presidency this year, so I want to hear from you all if you have thoughts on how India could be approaching this context and better leveraging the potential for partnerships in the way that they're approaching the digital public infrastructure conversation, and just generally what should be at the forefront of that agenda, both the challenges and the opportunities. So maybe start with you, Liv.
No, thank you for that question. And we've heard many pointers to this. So I tried here to sort of take a step-by-step approach. So I would love to actually go back to the India Stack again first. So the India Stack, it's first and foremost, it's a story of inclusion, and particularly, the financial inclusion. I think it was referred to what India did in 7 years that would have taken other countries 46 years if you looked at the traditional adoption trajectory, and including that, in particular, the empowerment of women as part of that financial inclusion. So it's a story of inclusion. I would also like to stress that it's a story of sovereignty, and this was mentioned in one of the previous panels. And what do I mean by sovereignty? India had the human capital and resources to basically build its own digital public infrastructure, meaning that the rights, the strategic management capabilities and opportunity to evolve and continuously adapt that infrastructure and build on it, that rests with India. So India Stack has been built over 10 years. It's taken time. And to have that strategic opportunity, if you look at many countries, particularly in the global south, particularly developing countries, they don't have that luxury of being able to build their own DPI. So the question is then, what options do they have? And the options, and so they will need to adopt something that already exists and to contextualize that to their needs. But those options have typically been proprietary solutions. And many countries have experienced vendor lock-in, both commercial vendor lock-in, but also I would say political vendor lock-in to other countries that have really dramatically reduced their digital sovereignty. And I think we're seeing now worldwide, and this is not only a low-income agenda at all. Across all income levels, countries are really, really concerned about protecting and strengthening and making sure they have this sovereignty, because it's so critical for all sectors and for attainment of all sustainable development goals. So then the question is, if we have the opportunity now, I would say this unique opportunity of a G20 presidency led by India, how can other countries, particularly then in the Global South, be supported to build their own inclusive and sovereign digital public infrastructure? And there I think there has been mentioned lots of great stuff today in different panels. We've heard about, I think it was Vajanti from the World Bank who mentioned global public goods. And that also includes non-digital, like knowledge. So sharing knowledge and learnings, best practices across countries, sharing frameworks. And there I think the India stack is an excellent framework for thinking about sovereignty and inclusion. It's about principles, shared principles. We've heard about standards. And I very much agree that standards is necessary, but I would say it's not sufficient in the sense that standards are driven by shared practices. So I would also encourage open source reference implementations of those standards as also a way of driving other objectives. And again, if we look at MOSIP, that's an example where a modular open source platform is also helping drive a lot of alignment around best practices and new standards in the identity space. So I'll be very quick because I know there are many we have short time, but just to look into then, if we try to think of this combination of learnings, standards, principles, frameworks, and then state-of-the-art open source, which is what I would refer to as DPGs in this context. So kind of extracting these principles that Rahul was referring to, this like the ultimate idea of something, but also have reference implementations of that, generic state-of-the-art. I think this is also something that would greatly benefit India in its ambitions. So first of all, it would drive more impact in terms of attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's like an impact case for it. I also think there is this recognition and visibility that I think India has belatedly gained for the India Stack story. I think it has not been sufficiently recognized. I think now it's starting to happen. But it should have been much more widely recognized earlier, and particularly by international development donors. I would like to say I come from that landscape myself. I think this is slowly now emerging. But I think that global recognition and visibility is a second good reason. I would also say that, as I mentioned, it will help drive the interoperability that we've heard so many asking for, because it drives this shared practice around these standards and protocols. So it can also advance those objectives. And lastly, I think also the private sector side here is critical, because indeed there is a large private sector ecosystem here. So the commercial opportunity, and that also includes commercial opportunities for large Indian vendors, is around the systems integration services that go hand in hand with these digital public goods or these open source systems. Because most countries will need support. There will be large procurement of services to support the implementation of these systems. I'm also a very strong advocate that we should really, really work to stimulate the local vendor ecosystem in the countries that are implementing these DPGs. But I think India could be a great player and take a strong role in being, in having its vendor industry work and support local vendor ecosystems that are implementing these open source technologies. So I think there are many benefits to India.
Those are some great thoughts. Let's move on. Maybe Kay or Chetan, if either of you wants to jump in on this.
Sure, I'm happy to propose a couple of ideas that we've been thinking about. One of them, which I think is a pretty low-risk approach, but would be really high reward, both for the government of India in terms of leaving a lasting legacy at the G20 would be to set up or to propose a standing partnership at the G20 that really focuses on digital public infrastructure designed, deployed, governed for people. Right? There's a very important parallel in the financial inclusion world, where in 2009, the government of South Korea proposed the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion in the wake of the financial crisis. And what that has done has kept financial inclusion as a standing agenda item for the G20, no matter which country has the presidency and no matter what is happening in the world that is kind of taking up the oxygen in the room. And while I can't say it's always been at the forefront, cutting edge of financial inclusion, it has played a very effective role in kind of making financial inclusion almost a de rigueur policy priority for very senior leaders of governments to continue to hear and to have the opportunity to talk about. And so I think there's a real opportunity for India's G20 presidency to think about some proposal like that and gain consensus. And then the second idea that we've been thinking about at the Digital Impact Alliance, I would say is a little bit higher risk, but I think equally or probably more important, right? Which is to really start this global dialogue around the safeguards, the norms and the principles, right? Because we desperately need to get to some sort of consensus about what those norms are and what the bare minimum safeguards are, so that we can more easily see countries and platforms that deviate from those norms. I do think that's a little higher risk because, while the India stack has been brilliant, India's track record on digital freedoms overall is globally not perceived to be great, right? It's got one of the highest amount of internet shutdowns in the world. And, I just worry that maybe it's harder for the government of India to be a messenger on the global stage of principles, digital principles designed for people. But hopefully I'm wrong about that. And of course, the other risk there is the obvious, that there's certainly no consensus around what safeguards and what good digital outcomes for people would look like among the 20 member states of the G20. And so I think it could be a little bit of a dangerous forum to make that the place for that kind of norm setting, standard setting. But it's a discussion that needs to happen somewhere soon.
No better place to get that started than here. I think we're now past the point of needing to move on to audience questions, but we do have time. So I want to invite everyone in the audience to come to a microphone if you have a question for the panelists. There are two in either. Go ahead.
The
We'll
question
take
is
a
for
couple of
Liv.
questions.
You spoke of MOSIF and similar infrastructures which are open source. So the question is, who maintains these? Who supports these? The core product. I'm not speaking about the suppliers who use it and implement it different companies. That's a separate issue. I'm speaking about the core product, who implements it, who supports it, who funds it, those kind of questions.
Thank you for. Should I? Do you want to take another question?
It's fine. We can go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so with MOSIP, I think I even saw Professor Rajagopalan here. So it's MOSIP is governed by IIITB, so the IIIT in Bangalore. And it's one example of a model. There are many other models for digital public goods. Funding is, for MOSIP, I know it very well because I was very involved in securing the Norwegian government's funding as one of the co-funders, with the Gates Foundation, the Omidyar Network, Tata Trust. So that's one example. But let me just mention a completely different example, because there are many different models here. If you look at X-Road, which is like the main government platform of Estonia, Finland, and Iceland, that is actually government technology that is maintained open source as a digital public good. And the governance of that is done by NIS, the Nordic Institute for Interoperability, I think it's called. And the core funding there is from those countries. But it's X-Road is adopted by many, many other countries as well. So that's one example. And then there are tons of others with different types of funding models. But yes, I do believe that core funding for maintaining DPGs is critically important. It's too important, particularly if we're talking about DPGs for digital public infrastructure. It's critically important to ensure they are funded.
And we have at least one more question. Please go ahead and we'll get both.
I had a question. You mentioned, I mean, so earlier Subnendo talking about payments mentioned the different layers, and the technology is not the problem. It's all kinds of other types of interoperability problems. And I like the fact that DPGA describes beyond just open source software. However, in my experience, engineers are very good at coming together and building cool things and collaborating. Policy wonks much less so. So how do we bring that open source mentality that engineers are so great at coming to the policy folks, to the lawyers, to the people writing regulations, so that every country doesn't have to replicate the wheel?
That's great, and we can move to the next question, but I always find it funny to juxtapose the ethos of the open source community of build modular, iterate, move fast, and see what works, and juxtapose that with the bureaucracy of governments who are working to adopt this kind of mindset. It's definitely a tension that I think needs to be navigated. But sorry, next question, and then we can turn the question to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Ameya Naik. I'm with the eGov Foundation. I'll direct my question to Kay, but I'm sure anyone else can jump in as well. I want to jump off the example, the second example that you used, right, which is the response in Ranchi, where people were saying that, I mean, outside Ranchi, where people were saying that they find that they're being excluded. And this reflects slightly a deeper worry that I have, which is that a lot of the conversation right now seems to be focused on essentially ID and payments, right? And the thing with ID and payments is that what you're doing is you're taking words that were written on paper and converting them to words that are on a screen. But government's responsibilities for service delivery don't start and end with taking words on paper and converting them to words on screen, right? Election slogans in India used to be roti, kapda, makan, bijli, sadak, pani, as in food, clothes, housing, roads, electricity, water. And so I'd love to hear some thoughts on sort of extending this beyond ID and payments, which are important, but as Liv put it earlier, necessary but not sufficient.
Two really good questions. Maybe Chetan, do you have thoughts on the first question?
No, first of all, I think yours is an extremely pessimistic, cynical view at this juncture, because all of us are aware that the digital infrastructure is a means to an end, right? End of the day, you have policies which ride on top of these infrastructures to primarily ensure that there are better road access, there's water, sanitation, and everything else. So, governments are seasoned enough to understand how to deploy the infrastructure and ensure scale. And again, I don't want to go into the success stories that have marked our experience, India's experience. Having said that, I do agree with you that it does take a fairly long amount of time for governments to build trust, to ensure that there is a degree of inclusivity and fair play and non-partisanship in the manner in which they're able to administer digital infrastructure, right? So clearly there is a role there, but my response is that you're taking an excessively lopsided view of things.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think it's a great point, right? The technology in some ways is the easy part, right? Figuring out how to implement it is far more difficult. And we, frankly, most governments are still built on a paradigm that is many, many decades old, right? And you look at governments, and when we're talking in particular about service delivery, it's very siloed into these verticals of agriculture, health, education. And when we're talking about DPI and these platforms, we're really looking at more horizontal or vertical layers. And that's causing a problem not only for the funders, you know, that are thinking about how to shift, you know, the way we distribute resources, but also all the way down to the implementation of how do you integrate these systems into existing paper-based systems that have their own problems, right? It's a huge change management exercise that I think we really cannot underestimate as we think about rolling this out. It's really not just the technology. It's about the redesign of processes and building entirely new capabilities in the public sector.
So really great insights. I want to thank you all again, and we don't have time for a wrap up, but I do want to say, Chetan, what you just said, I think rings true and should be emphasized, that so much of this rests on governments building trusts with their public, and that takes time, and that takes patience, and it also takes a lot of different stakeholders. It cannot just be done with the government alone. And I do think that the collaborative partnerships that we've talked about today are all very important, right? Private sector, public sector, nonprofits, academic. But maybe one of the more fundamental partnerships that needs to be centered here is the partnership between governments and their publics, right, and their citizens. So with that, we'll wrap and move on to the next panel. Thank you all so much.